Welcome to Old School and Obscure, a look at the science fiction novels which to me are sort of famous because, you know, I'm an old guy. But then again, if you're a lot younger than me, or if you've only been coming to SF recently, or you've just been going for the bestsellers, you might not know them. So I just thought I'd talk about a few favourites. And this is a bit of a theme today. We're looking at alternate history or alternative history. I like alternate history. It just rolls off the tongue more nicely. So, and of course you're going to know this one. This is, you know, arguably the most famous one. And this is The Man in the High Castle. You might have seen the dreadful TV show from Amazon, which isn't very good at all. And this is the first edition, the US world first edition of The Man in the High Castle by PKD. Very rare book. It was given to me by one of my customers many years ago, back in the 90s, when I was running an international mail order book selling company. There was no internet then, so it was all faxes, telephone calls, letters, that sort of thing. And he was a really nice German guy who ran a really big advertising agency initially on Madison Avenue when he was young in the late 50s, which is when he got into SF, and then later on in Germany. Lovely guy, Helmut Schmidt, Superman, and he gave me that, which was really, really nice. So you'll know this one, and this is the classic Axis wins. As you see, we've got the rising sun of Japan and the old swastika there, and that's probably the most famous alternative history and probably the most famous alternative history scenario. They do tend to fall into particular scenarios, and let's have a look on the back there. There's PKD, and I've put a little postcard in there from the Penguin SF postcards box. And yeah, that's an old sort of 70s cover for Man in the High Castle. One of the more common themes which pops up again and again, not so much in recent years, is what if the Confederacy had won the Civil War? And you've got things like Guns of the South by Harry Turtledove, who's done a lot of alt histories, and that's quite an interesting one in that there's a cache of machine guns sent back in time to the Confederates, and you know, they win the war as a result. This is probably the first one. There may be others, but this is the first really famous one, and this is Ward Moore, Bring the Jubilee. I love that tile. Fantastic tile, and it's got this very Norman Rockwell type sort of picture on the cover. This is absolutely beautiful. Look at that, really great stuff. And this is absolutely great. It's such a good book, and it dates back to 1953. And Ward Moore was born in 1903 and died in 1978. And he mostly a lot of short stories and things, and he's quite obscure these days. This is in print. It's a Golax masterwork in the UK. The US, I'm not sure. But it's really great stuff. And on the cover, Ray Bradbury says, one of the best American writers. So look at that. Praise indeed. So if you get that, get out there and get it. And it's really, really good. So, and rather like Man in the High Castle, it's not massively melodramatic and all action and what have you. It's a bit more thoughtful than that. So I'll tell you a bit about it. The central character is a guy called Hodge Backmaker. Hodge Backmaker, I love that. And he's born in the 1920s, and he grows up in a rural community in the Hudson River Valley. And he's sort of fascinated by the stories he hears when he's growing up of the years of the War of Southron Independence, 70 years before. In the war, the Confederate South won independence from the North and went on to become the world's superpower. So it's, you know, two Americas, basically. And what Hodge wants to do is he wants to become a great historian and scholar. So he's going to sort of undertake some study of this, and he looks at the war, and he escapes the provincial backwater that he lives in and heads for New York. And even there, however, he finds himself in a world of decline and decadence. The city isn't the sort of vast, sophisticated metropolis that we know in our world, but it's a town of cobblestones and gas lamps and backwardness. And real power and cutting-edge technology lies in the south, in great cities like Leesburg, you know, which is Leesburg, Robert E. Lee, Confederate general. So Hodge takes a job in a kind of very seedy sort of bookshop, and he still yearns for the life of academia, and you know, he really wants to sort of be a scholar. So he applies to join this eccentric academic community, which is called Hagershaven. And he's accepted, and in these sort of ivory towers, he finds a kind of contentment and happiness. There's a woman there, and one of his fellow scholars, a lady called Barbara Hagerswell, who is a descendant of Hagershaven's founder. So Hagerswell, Hagershaven, you see the similarity there. And she's a descendant of the founder of this community. And she's a brilliant physicist and cosmologist, and she's working on a time machine. Barbara's experiments prove successful, and Hodge decides that he's going to fulfill every historian's dream by witnessing at first hand the events of which so far he's only read in the Southern War of Independence. So he gets in the time machine and uses it to travel back into the past, and he arrives at Gettysburg on the eve of the Great Battle, where his own presence is about to divert history, or not, onto another path. And it's really gripping stuff. It's got wonderful sort of prose style. Bradbury, as they liked it. It did remind me of Bradbury when I read it. And it's, one of the great works of alternative history. So unlike a lot of examples of the subgenre in which most of the energy goes into the invention of the parallel world and far less goes into plot and characterization, the exception of that is the PKD one. And all these books I'm going to talk about today are stronger on that, because that's the real thing, how the alternate world would affect people. It's just marvelous stuff, It creates not only a convincing alternative America, but it tells, a really gripping story about a likable, interesting individual who you really root for. And I was in two minds about one aspect, which was that I think any alternative history novel that's got a time machine in it is kind of a fudge, really. I sort of like that thing where there's a definitive event and it changes things, and it doesn't sort of spin on that. But this is really well done, and if you like the sort of pastoral works of people like Ray Bradbury, if you like sort of people like Pat Frank, it's really good, and it's something which I think really should be better read. I'd quite like to see it become a Penguin modern classic. What the critics will think of that, I don't know. So he also wrote a book called Greener Than You Think about the same time, which is more satirical. It's about a plant which sort of takes over the world. Somebody's fiddling around with pesticides and they make a goof up of it, and this plant sort of grows everywhere, this grass grows everywhere, greener than you think. So it's sort of the opposite of John Christopher's Death of Grass, really. So so if you like these sort of things, other things to watch out for, there used to be a great anthology called Hitler Wins, which was edited by Gregory Benford. That's a good one. And you get things like Christopher Priest's Separation, Robert Silverberg's Roma Eterna, in which the Roman Empire never falls, and Harry Turtle's Guns of the South, as I say. But to move on, a book I mentioned in my sort of top 25 by a writer called Keith Roberts was this book, Pavan. And I actually put his book Molly Zero into my top 25, but I mentioned this and showed different editions. Now Pavan is kind of the one, really, and this was my first copy of Pavan in King Penguin, which I bought in the early 80s. This is really quite something, so I wanted to cover it again. If you buy a copy of Pavan, if you buy an early one, it's not the complete text because it was published as a series of linked stories in a magazine called SF Impulse, who Keith Roberts used to do the covers very often, interior illustrations, and he was often the editor as well. He also wrote under the names John Kingston and Alistair Bevan. I think he might have only done drawings under the name John Kingston, because his full name was John Kingston Keith Roberts. And Pavan is just absolutely fantastic, beautiful cover as you see. And I'm just going to pop up the Golax hardcover reissue here. I don't have a first hardcover of this because it's very expensive. It's hard to find in good neck. I will try and get one day. It does sort of bug me because I've got most of Keith's books in first, but it's not complete. As I say, it was published by Hart Davis. Keith was one of the most offbeat and exciting talents the British SF ever produced. And the sort of cautiousness which publishers applied to his work, as he was difficult and cantankerous, is sort of combined to create circumstances in which his books really failed to get the audience they deserved. They all have an originality that few other writers can match. Decades and decades, it's so long, it's like 60 years nearly after it was published, and it's still one of the greatest works of alternative history, and it's probably only matched by Man in the High Castle, really. And in this, the Spanish Armada has succeeded, Queen Elizabeth's been assassinated, and it's set in 1966 when the book was published in Impulse. And basically it's a different 1966, it's a backward 1966, because the Catholic Church has sort of prevented technology from going too far. But it's about to change, really, and it's just got wonderful, wonderful stuff in it. Pavan is a kind of dance. It's a stately court dance of the 16th century, and there's a sort of folk element to it as well. The dance has measures, each sort of steps, different measures throughout the dance, and the individual stories in the book, which link together into the novel, are called measures, and then there's a coda, an ending part as the music ends, and we see what Keith himself thinks of this alternate world. And it's got lovely stuff in it. There's monks maintaining centuries old traditions, there's would-be inventors who are dreaming of change but they can't, do what they want to do because it'd be heretical. And of course, people like Galileo and, you know, Da Vinci come up against this in Italy, and Renaissance Italy, the popes and things. There's semaphore operators who are doing long distance communications because there isn't telecom. They've got these, they're exiled in these remote signalling stations, and it's a sort of particularly English version of an alternative past. Robert's own sort of love for the British countryside really comes through, and there's folklore in the book about fairies and hobgoblins. There's ruined remnants of castles and churches, and it sort of blends together potential versions of past and present into a sort of mesmerizing whole and a magnificent climax, which does make you think about, was it good to have the kind of advance, the rapid advance we had, and once we escaped from the domination of the church? And it's a key question, because in science fiction, once rationalism came on board in the Enlightenment, the late 18th century, there was no holding science back, and, you know, and we ended up with lots of great things. We also ended up with the horrors of World War One and World War Two, so that's something to think about. If you know that book and enjoy it, I'm going to recommend something similar, which takes the same basic idea of a continuous Catholic domination of Europe in Britain, and that's Kingsley Amis's The Alteration, one of Kingsley's science fiction novels. This is the Cape first edition, not an uncommon book. It's in print in the UK from Vintage. I think in the States there's an MYRB classic of it. Yeah, there is, and it's really handsome paperback. And Kingsley Amis, of course, came to prominence in the late 1950s as one of the angry young men. He was sort of like a rebellious conservative. He liked James Bond, he liked jazz, he liked SF. He was regarded as a bit of an anti-intellectual Philistine by later New Wave writers and what have you. But he wrote really well, you know, and he could write anything. He wrote a great ghost story called The Green Man. He wrote spy things. He wrote a lot of social comedies, a lot of things about sex and men and women. In The Green Man, which is a fantastic ghost story, as I say, it's set in a pub, and the landlord is just all the way through trying to get a threesome organised with his wife and her best friend, to not much avail. And at the same time, it's got this haunting thing there. He's sort of more distracted by the sexual elements. So it's quite funny. But The Alteration, again, is set in a Britain where the Catholic Church still sort of rules in the 60s and 70s. And the Pope is a Yorkshireman. And there's a funny bit where the Pope is with the young character, the central character. This is a young boy. He's a choir boy, and he sings really, really beautifully, you know, to the glory of God. And he goes to see the Pope, and the Pope sort of says, "Shall I be mother and make the tea?" And it's really sort of witty and British. And the young lad, he in this difficult situation because the church want to make him a castrati. They want to remove his genitals. It's a difficult situation, so that his voice stays high, so he can stay that way, because the castrati were a real thing in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But of course, he's not so keen on that idea. So there's a certain amount of ribald humour around that. And he and his friends, there's wonderful sequences where they're in their dorm, and I think 3 of them share a room or something, and they're reading science fiction, and they're reading books by Keith Roberts and Philip K. Dick. They're reading alternative history novels which exist in this world. So it's wonderful sort of recursive referencing there. The prose is absolutely magnificent. So if you like Pavan and you like the more literary end of the alternative history, you can't really go wrong with The Alteration. It's a fantastic book. So this is the Cape first edition. I bought this, came out in the 70s, early to mid 70s, and I bought it in 1987, and it was still in print. I was in work and I looked it up, and I could see that Cape still had it, even though they'd been a paperback for years, and I got it, and it's absolutely beautiful. So that's a great one to watch. So there's a few alternate histories for you. Hope you enjoy those. Seek them out and enjoy the very best, the subtlest, the richest alternative histories there have been.